The screen opens on silence, heavy and suffocating. A line of Japanese women, their faces pale from weeks of captivity, shuffle forward under the watch of armed guards. Dust clings to their torn uniforms, and their eyes, hollow with exhaustion, avoid the gaze of their captors. Each step is weighed down by dread. They whisper to one another in fragments of fear. They are certain this is the march toward humiliation, toward filth, toward the punishment that has been promised by years of wartime propaganda. In their minds, America is the land of vengeance, and now, behind the barbed wire of a prison camp, that vengeance is about to begin. The date is June 1944, and the location is a processing center in Stockton, California. The war in the Pacific rages on, and these women, captured nurses and clerks from abandoned outposts, have crossed the ocean under the crushing weight of defeat. Their bodies ache from confinement on transport ships. Their stomachs churn from malnutrition. But above all, their spirits quake at what they expect next: dark cells, spoiled food, and deliberate degradation. They bow low, not out of choice but instinct, bracing for the blow in their imagination. An American camp is no better than the bamboo cages where Allied prisoners once wasted away in the jungles of Southeast Asia. A woman named Keiko, a former typist, remembers the stories her commander once told that surrender meant a slow death, that the Americans despised weakness and would strip prisoners of their last shred of honor. She clutches her sleeves tighter, waiting for the order to descend into that nightmare. Instead, the silence shatters with words they do not understand at first. The officer's command is short, clipped, spoken through an interpreter. They are to be washed, issued clean clothes, and given soap. The women freeze, their eyes darting in disbelief. Soap. It sounds like mockery, a cruel joke before the real cruelty begins. Yet the guards remain impassive, pointing toward a row of bathhouses glinting in the sunlight. The air carries not the stench of rot, but the faint, incongruous smell of laundry detergent drifting from the camp's facilities. This first moment is unbearable in its contradictions. Fear collides with order, suspicion with civility. No blows fall, no curses are hurled. Instead, the women are herded not into darkness but toward light, toward steam rising from water tanks, toward shelves stacked with folded garments. It is the last sight they expected to see for the viewer. The image lingers: bowed figures, trembling in anticipation of torment, suddenly confronted with basins of warm water and neatly wrapped bars of soap. This clash of worlds is the spark that begins the unraveling of every assumption they carried across the Pacific. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. And share with us in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time is it where you are now? The journey that brought these women to America was as punishing as any battlefield. After their capture in the Solomon Islands and in Rabaul, Papua New Guinea, orders came down in late May 1944 to transfer a group of female non-combatants, clerks, nurses, and civilian auxiliaries to the United States. They were herded aboard the USS General John Pope, a massive transport vessel converted to carry prisoners of war. Its steel belly echoed with the groans of hundreds of captured soldiers and women, crammed together in holds that once carried military cargo. For 22 days, they crossed the Pacific. The ship pitched violently in summer storms, salt water spraying through tiny portholes, while the women huddled on the deck when allowed, shielding their faces with thin cloth. Guards kept watch, rifles slung over their shoulders, but rarely spoke. The silence of the voyage was punctuated only by the clanging of mess tins, the coughing of seasick prisoners, and the dull thrum of engines that seemed to beat like an iron heart. On the 12th day, near Hawaii, a rumor swept the prisoners. Some claimed they saw American sailors unloading crates marked soap alongside barrels of flour and rice. To the Japanese women, it sounded absurd. Why would soap be carried as carefully as food? But the crates were real. A nurse named Fumiko later scribbled in a confiscated diary, "We saw with our own eyes. Soap, like treasure. I thought they must be preparing to mock us with it." The word mock underlined twice. Her hand shaky from seasickness and dread by the time the ship sailed past the Golden Gate and into San Francisco Bay. The women had become shadows of themselves. California's coastline gleamed under the June sun. Factories' smokestacks painting thin columns against the sky. The sight itself was disorienting. They had been taught America was crumbling, weakened by war. Yet here stood bridges stretching like iron miracles, rail lines glinting with constant traffic, and cities alive with light. The train journey southward to Stockton was no less bewildering, through barred windows. The women glimpsed endless rows of farmland wheat fields swaying like golden seas, orchards heavy with fruit, water channels glimmering between neat lines of crops, compared to ration-starved Japan, where a single orange could be a festival. This abundance was staggering. Some prisoners whispered to each other in disbelief, wondering if the Americans had staged this scenery as propaganda. One older woman muttered, "They must have hidden their ruins from us. The war cannot look like this." At Stockton, the camp gates loomed, barbed wire, wooden guard towers, sentries at every corner, yes. These confirmed the stories of captivity, but within, there were brick bathhouses, rows of wooden barracks with windows, and laundry lines fluttering with clean sheets. The women stepped off the train expecting to be dragged into shadows, but instead they were marched in daylight toward a place that was not welcoming, yet not the pit of despair they feared. That first order. Take them to bathe would not have been possible without this journey across seas and fields, where every detail contradicted the world they thought they knew. The voyage itself was an initiation, a passage from illusion into a harsher, stranger truth. Inside the Stockton camp's intake hall, the women were ordered to line up in silence. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, catching on the dust of the long journey. In the corner, wooden tables were stacked with folded uniforms, khaki shirts, cotton dresses, undergarments, items so ordinary to Americans, yet so unimaginable to the prisoners. An American sergeant, clipboard in hand, read their names aloud from lists provided by the transport ship. Each woman stepped forward, gave her details through an interpreter, and was then directed toward the bathhouse. At the threshold, a young corporal pressed into their palms a small bar wrapped in thin paper, soap. The first to take it was Fumiko, the nurse who had written of her disbelief at sea. Her hand trembled as she unwrapped the pale rectangle, its faint scent of lavender drifting upward. In wartime Japan, soap had become scarce, rationed until entire families shared a single fragment. Soldiers on the front often had none at all. Now, to hold a full bar unused, smooth, glistening felt almost unbearable. Fumiko whispered, "This is more than food." A guard overheard, but said nothing. The women stepped into rows of stalls where warm water steamed from overhead pipes. For many, it was their first hot bath in months. Some gasped aloud, others sobbed quietly, washing grime and salt from their skin. The sound of water slapping concrete echoed through the chamber, mingled with voices that wavered between relief and shame. Keiko, the former typist, stared at her reflection in a small mirror provided near the exit. She wrote later in a confiscated note, "My face looked back at me. Not an animal, not a defeated slave, but still a woman. I thought the soap was washing away my country's lies." When they emerged, their ragged uniforms were taken, replaced by clean garments from camp stores. The act itself was a revelation. These clothes, plain and utilitarian, were not meant to degrade them but to make them feel human again. They were not adorned with markings of punishment. No symbols of ridicule, just simple cotton that smelled faintly of detergent and sun. For the guards, this was routine. The U.S. military operated under the Geneva Conventions, and soap was simply part of issued rations. But for the prisoners, it was nothing short of revolutionary. In their minds, enemies did not grant such things, in their experience. Japan itself had taught them that captives were stripped of dignity, starved, beaten, reduced to shadows, to be handed cleanliness instead of dirt, comfort instead of cruelty, was a reversal so extreme it made their hearts race with confusion. In one corner of the intake hall, a woman clutched her soap tightly even after she dressed. She refused to set it down, holding it like a talisman. The interpreter tried to explain she would receive another when needed, but she shook her head. "This is proof," she whispered to herself. "Proof I am still alive." That night, as the camp settled into silence, the faint fragrance of soap lingered in the women's barracks. For some, it was the first peaceful scent they had known since the war began. Morning in Stockton camp began with a whistle. The women rose from their bunks, the air inside the barracks heavy with the mingled scents of soap, cotton, and boiled coffee drifting faintly from the American kitchens. Outside, the sun cut across neat rows of laundry lines strung between barracks. White sheets swayed like quiet banners in the breeze, transforming the prison yard into something strangely domestic for the women, accustomed to scarcity and filth. This rhythm of ordinary order was its own form of shock. Each day followed a schedule, posted in both English and Japanese translation wake, roll call, meals, work assignments, free hours, lights out. The structure itself felt alien. They expected chaos, punishment, and arbitrary cruelty, but instead found predictability meals served at the same time, inspections conducted with formality rather than violence, even a camp infirmary staffed with American medics. One morning, Keiko watched an American guard pour steaming coffee into his tin mug, adding a spoonful of sugar with casual ease. That sugar glittered in the sunlight, more precious to her eyes than gold. In Japan, sugar had become almost mythical. Children whispered of it as a memory from before the war. She wrote later, a spoonful was a festival, and here he wasted it without thought. The bitterness of envy twisted inside her, but so did a grudging admiration for the scale of American abundance. The routines soon exposed contrasts that gnawed at the prisoners. On laundry day, they were issued basins, soap flakes, and brushes, told to wash their own clothes and bedding. Rows of women bent over wooden tubs, their hands raw, but their garments emerged bright and fresh. Gossip flowed with the suds. One prisoner whispered that she had seen a guard carry extra socks to a fellow captive. Another claimed the American cooks slipped fruit into meals on Sundays. A rumor even spread that someone overheard guards debating baseball games. Not war strategies, a detail so mundane it unsettled the women more than threats could. Still, suspicion lingered. Some prisoners muttered that all this civility was staged, a mask for propaganda. "They want us to forget Japan," one woman hissed, wringing out her blouse with sudden anger, but another countered quietly, "If it is a mask, it is a mask kinder than our reality." The argument fizzled, leaving only the rhythm of dripping water and the flutter of drying cloth. Human moments punctured the monotony. Fumiko once dropped her bar of soap in the mud, and before she could retrieve it, a young American guard picked it up and handed it back without a word. The gesture was small, almost careless, but it struck her deeply in a world where soap meant dignity. He had preserved hers. That night, she told the story to the barracks, and though some scoffed, others listened in silence, turning the thought over in their minds like a stone in their hands. The days stretched on, not in agony, but in an unfamiliar routine of survival. The women washed, ate, slept, and repeated. Yet beneath that repetition, something shifted. Cleanliness, once a forgotten luxury, became a daily reminder that they were still seen as human beings, not animals waiting for disposal. And as they lay in their bunks at night, the faint creak of laundry lines outside whispered a quiet truth. Captivity here was rewriting the memory of war, thread by thread, cloth by cloth, in the rhythm of ordinary life. So, as weeks turned into months, the women began to find themselves caught between two worlds, the Japan they remembered and the strange civility of their confinement in America. What had seemed like tricks at first were becoming undeniable facts. Food came regularly. Soap was replenished, clothes were kept clean, and no deliberate humiliation was inflicted. Yet within the barracks, suspicion smoldered, flaring into heated disputes that revealed the fractures among them. Keiko, still clutching fragments of loyalty to the empire, scolded those who grew too comfortable. "Do not be deceived," she warned one evening, her voice sharp over the rattling of tin cups. "This is poison disguised as kindness. They want us to forget who we are." Some nodded, retreating into silence, but others dared to argue back. Fumiko whispered, almost trembling, "If poison tastes like bread and soap, then why does it feel like life returning?" Her words hung in the air, a dangerous defiance of all they had been taught. Letters played their part in this silent war of belief. Though heavily censored, women were permitted to send brief notes back to Japan. Interpreters reviewed every word, but sometimes confiscated drafts revealed their true emotions. One note, never mailed, read, "I expected chains and darkness. Instead, they gave me water and cloth. I do not know what to believe anymore. Another scribbled entry. How cruel. That our enemies restore what our leaders took from us: soap, sugar, even laughter in small moments. These revelations ignited tension. A handful of women, fearful of dishonor, tore up their soap rations, grinding the pieces into the dirt as if to prove their loyalty. Others secretly traded small portions of coffee or fruit, savoring each bite like stolen treasure. Gossip spread quickly. One woman had laughed at an American joke during roll call. Another had accepted a cigarette offered by a guard. Each act became fuel for whispers of betrayal. The camp itself seemed indifferent to these private storms. Laundry lines continued to flap in the wind. Kitchens churned out meals. Guards rotated shifts. But inside the barracks, the emotional stakes deepened. Honor clashed with survival, pride with gratitude, ideology with experience. Every bar of soap handed out at the bathhouse was more than hygiene. It was a choice. Keep it, and acknowledge a new truth. Reject it, and cling to the old. One evening, as the women sat in dim lamplight, a question emerged, almost unspoken but impossible to silence had they been lied to all along for years. Their newspapers screamed that Americans were beasts, that surrender meant degradation worse than death. Yet here, even as prisoners, they were treated with a strange restraint. And so I must pause, dear viewer, and ask you if you were in their place, stripped of certainty, offered unexpected dignity by the very enemy you feared. What would you choose to believe? Would you cling to the story you were told, or to the reality you now lived? Share your thoughts in the comments. The camp soon became a theater of contradictions, where every site chipped away at old certainties. The Japanese women expected cruelty, yet what they saw each day shocked them in ways more profound than violence. One morning, they were marched past the camp gates to perform supervised labor in nearby warehouses. There, they saw African American workers unloading trucks side by side with white Americans, their pay the same, their uniforms indistinguishable. For women raised in a rigid society that placed outsiders at the bottom of humanity, this equality struck like lightning. Keiko whispered, "Impossible. In Japan, they would not be allowed to stand among us." Her voice quivered not with disdain but with disbelief. That night, the barracks buzzed with whispers. Was America not only richer, but freer in ways their homeland had never admitted? The next revelation came from the sight of American women. On certain days, Stockton's canteens filled with female factory workers, hair tied back with scarves, uniforms stained with oil, hands scarred from machinery. They laughed loudly, carrying their lunchboxes of bread, apples, and milk bottles for the prisoners. Raised to believe women's place was in the home, the spectacle was overwhelming. Fumiko admitted in a diary scrap later confiscated, "I did not think a woman could command a space with her voice." Yet here, their laughter is stronger than men's orders. Another moment seared itself into memory, a farmer's truck delivering produce to the camp. 2 American children, no older than 10, sat in the back, legs swinging, chewing on bright red apples. One of them tossed an apple casually to a guard, who caught it with a grin. For the prisoners, it was unbearable. Children in Japan dreamed of rice gruel while American children wasted fruit. Some cried openly, not just for hunger, but for the cruel scale of contrast. Each of these encounters was a blade cutting through years of propaganda. They had been told America was decadent, corrupt, collapsing under its own greed. Instead, they saw a society that even in wartime overflowed with resources, allowed women to wield wrenches, and treated black workers as equals in ways unthinkable to the Japanese hierarchy of the 1940s. But with revelation came inner collapse, in private. Some women began to wonder if their sacrifices for the empire had been for nothing. Others doubled down, clinging to pride as if it were the last weapon left. One evening, a fierce debate erupted in the barracks, voices raised, tears spilling. "Do not believe their lies," Keiko cried, pounding her fist against the wooden wall. Fumiko answered, quieter but sharper, "Then why do their lies feed us better than our truths?" Silence followed, heavy and suffocating. And now, I ask you, viewer, imagine being torn between loyalty to your homeland and the undeniable evidence before your eyes. Which would you trust, propaganda that demanded death, or the soap, bread, and equality you could touch with your own hands? Write your answer below. I want to know what you think. By the spring of 1945, the tide of war had shifted irrevocably. News filtered into the Stockton camp in fragments Germany had fallen. Tokyo was burning under waves of bombers, and whispers of a terrifying new weapon crackled through guarded conversations. The Japanese women in captivity sat between two realities, their homeland crumbling, their present defined by soap, clothing, and routine dignity they could never have imagined before their capture. Preparation for repatriation began quietly. Camp officials distributed notices, and interpreters explained that once the war ended, they would be returned across the Pacific. The women listened in silence, their expressions a mixture of relief, suspicion, and something harder to define hesitation: home. Once the only dream, now seemed distant and uncertain. Would they still belong to a country that had taught them Americans were devils, when their own experience had shown something far more complex? Fumiko, the nurse, wrote in one of her final diary entries before it was confiscated, "When I return, what will I tell them? That the enemy gave me soap, and I wept, that their children ate apples while ours starved, that women here build airplanes while ours bury sons." The words, though never mailed, became testimony that history would one day uncover. On their last day in Stockton, the women were ordered to turn in camp uniforms. They folded the clothes carefully, some with a tenderness that surprised even themselves. Each was issued travel garments for the long journey home, but it was the small items, the bars of soap, the cotton kerchiefs, the clean socks that many stared at with longing. These objects, mundane to Americans, had become powerful symbols of dignity restored. The contrast between expectations and reality had seared itself into memory. They had arrived bowed low, certain of humiliation. They left standing straighter, not because they had been triumphant, but because they had been seen as human. The bitter propaganda that once fueled their loyalty had shattered against the quiet, persistent kindness of ordinary routine hot water, clean sheets, fresh uniforms, soap. As the transport ship pulled away from San Francisco Bay, the Golden Gate Bridge stretched overhead, a silent monument of steel and light. Many of the women looked up through the mist, some in awe, some in sorrow. For Keiko, once the most resistant, tears filled her eyes unbidden. She whispered to herself words no one else could hear. "We were told they would strip us. Instead, they clothed us." Victory in the Pacific would be written in bombs, battles, and the agony of surrender. But for these women, another legacy endured: a bar of soap that had restored dignity, a clean uniform that had reminded them of humanity, and a memory of captivity that became, paradoxically, a lesson in civilization. And so, when they returned to Japan, changed, conflicted, carrying whispers of a different truth, they carried more than scars of war. They carried the indelible memory of being treated not as enemies to be broken, but as human beings allowed to remain whole. Night settles over the memory of Stockton Camp. The barbed wire, the watchtowers, the uniforms all dissolve into shadows, leaving behind only a faint scent, as if soap itself lingers in history. The story of these women is not one of battles or triumphs written in medals and flags, but of small, human gestures that endured when weapons fell silent. History so often remembers the bombs, the mushroom clouds, the firestorms, the numbers of dead counted in tens of thousands. Yet here, in the quiet rhythm of a prison camp, another kind of legacy was born. It was the legacy of a simple bar of soap pressed into a trembling hand, of clean clothes folded neatly on a table, of dignity restored where humiliation was expected. These are gestures so small they might have gone unnoticed. And yet, for those who lived them, they became unforgettable. One can imagine an old woman, decades later, sitting in post-war Japan, her family around her, and still remembering the sound of laundry lines snapping in the California breeze. Perhaps she still dreamed of that first warm bath, the water running over skin that had braced only for pain. Perhaps she still remembered the shock of an American child biting into an apple, a sight that told her more about abundance than any speech or document could. The irony is sharp, almost cruel, that an enemy nation could provide what one's own leaders had denied: food, soap, a chance to feel human. And yet, in that irony lay a fragile seed of reconciliation, proof that even in war, the smallest kindness could ripple outward through decades. A bar of soap cannot end a war, but it can live on as a symbol that war does not always destroy every trace of humanity. That is the quiet, lingering truth of these women's captivity, and perhaps the reason we must remember it.